On March 15, 1973, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 22-year-old clockmaker's apprentice Sarah Kellerman vanished from her father's downtown shop during the evening rush hour. Her purse sat untouched on the counter, classical music still playing on the radio, and the front door remained unlocked, as if she'd simply stepped into thin air. Before we begin, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from. We're really curious. We hope you enjoy listening to this thrilling story. The grandfather clocks in Wilhelm Kellerman's shop measured time with Germanic precision, their synchronized pendulums marking each second like a mechanical heartbeat through downtown Cedar Rapids. Sarah had grown up among these timepieces, learning to read their rhythms before she could properly tell time herself. At 22, she moved through the narrow aisles with practiced grace, dusting crystal faces and winding springs with the same methodical care her father had taught her since childhood. March 15, 1973 began like any other Wednesday. The morning light filtered through the shop's tall windows, casting amber shadows across rows of pocket watches and mantel clocks. Sarah arranged the display cases while classical music drifted from the radio, Pachelbel's canon providing a gentle backdrop to the symphony of ticking. She wore her engagement ring, a modest solitaire that caught the light as she worked, and hummed along with the melody. Robert Chen, her fiancé, would arrive at 7 to walk her home for dinner with her parents, just as he had every Wednesday for the past 6 months. Wilhelm watched his daughter from behind the repair counter, his jeweler's loupe catching the light as he bent over a delicate mechanism. Sarah represented everything he valued: precision, reliability, beauty maintained through discipline. She had never given him cause for worry, never questioned the careful structure of their family business, never expressed interest in anything beyond the safe boundaries of Cedar Rapids. When Robert had asked permission to marry her, Wilhelm had approved not just of the young banker's prospects, but of his understanding that Sarah would remain close to home, close to the shop that had defined 3 generations of Kellermans. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers. Mrs. Patterson needed her anniversary clock repaired before the weekend. Mr. Kowalski inquired about a pocket watch for his grandson's confirmation. Sarah handled each transaction with quiet competence, writing careful notes in her precise script and wrapping purchases in the shop's signature brown paper. She moved between the front counter and the repair area, bringing her father components and taking dictation for work orders, their partnership as seamless as the clockwork mechanisms surrounding them. By late afternoon, the familiar rhythm of the shop had lulled both father and daughter into comfortable routine. Wilhelm lost himself in the intricate gears of a century-old Swiss movement, while Sarah balanced the day's receipts. The lavender perfume she wore, a gift from Robert, mingled with the familiar sense of brass polish and machine oil. Outside, downtown Cedar Rapids prepared for evening, office workers heading home past the courthouse and the Five and Dime, their footsteps echoing off wet pavement from the morning's light rain. At 6:30, Wilhelm looked up to find Sarah gone from the front counter. He assumed she had stepped into the back room to retrieve something from inventory, or perhaps had gone upstairs to their small apartment to freshen up before Robert's arrival. The shop felt oddly quiet without her presence, though the clocks continued their relentless marking of time. He returned to his work, expecting to hear her footsteps on the wooden floors or the soft clearing of her throat that usually announced her return. When Robert arrived at precisely 7 o'clock, his punctuality matching the German precision of the shop itself, he found the front door unlocked and the lights still burning. Sarah's purse sat untouched on the counter beside the open cash register, $23 in bills still visible in the drawer. Her engagement ring lay beside it, something that would later puzzle investigators, as she had never been known to remove it during business hours. The radio continued playing classical music, and the air still held the faint sweetness of her lavender perfume, as if she had simply dissolved into the amber atmosphere of the shop. Wilhelm emerged from the repair area, his face showing the first flicker of concern as he saw Robert standing alone among the timepieces. They called Sarah's name, checked the inventory room, climbed the stairs to the apartment above. Everything remained exactly as she had left it that morning, her bed made with hospital corners, her few personal belongings arranged with the same careful precision she brought to the shop. It was as if she had been erased from existence, while the clocks continued their eternal count, marking each passing second with mechanical indifference to human disappearance. Police radio static crackled through the night air as Detective Frank Morrison pulled up to the Kellerman clock shop at 8:15 that evening. The squad car's headlights swept across the storefront, illuminating the gold lettering that read "Precision Timepieces since 1923" in careful script. Morrison had been investigating missing persons for 12 years, but something about this case felt different from the moment he stepped through the unlocked door and heard the synchronized ticking of 100 clocks measuring time that Sarah Kellerman was no longer there to witness. Wilhelm Kellerman sat rigid in a wooden chair behind the repair counter, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Robert Chen paced the narrow aisle between display cases, his banker's composure cracking as he repeated the same details for the third time. Morrison lit a lucky strike and let the smoke drift toward the pressed tin ceiling while he absorbed the scene. The cash register remained open, money untouched. Sarah's purse sat exactly where Robert had found it, contents undisturbed: lipstick, compact mirror, house keys, and a small appointment book with nothing scheduled beyond her regular Wednesday evening dinner. The detective's preliminary interviews revealed a young woman whose life followed patterns as regular as the clockwork surrounding them. Sarah woke at 6:30 each morning, opened the shop at 9, ate lunch at noon, and never varied from routine. She attended the Lutheran church on Sundays, participated in the church social committee, and had no known enemies or romantic complications beyond her engagement to Robert. Morrison's experience told him that people didn't simply vanish from locked rooms, but the physical evidence suggested exactly that impossibility. By midnight, patrol officers had canvassed a 6-block radius without finding a single witness who had seen Sarah leave the shop. The alley behind the building showed no signs of struggle, no unusual tire tracks in the soft earth from the morning's rain. Morrison arranged for bloodhounds from the state police to arrive at dawn, though he harbored little hope they would find a scent trail on downtown sidewalks traveled by hundreds of people daily. The methodical search would continue, but already he sensed the frustrating emptiness that characterized cases where evidence simply didn't exist. Thursday morning brought volunteers from Sarah's church and the wider Cedar Rapids community. They spread through Brucemore Park and along the Cedar River, calling her name and searching through brush and under bridges. The bloodhounds arrived as promised, their handlers working them through the shop and into the surrounding streets. The dogs showed interest in Sarah's scent leading to the front door, then nothing, as if her trail had been lifted into the air and carried away on invisible wings. Morrison established a command post at the police station, where cigarette smoke hung thick in the fluorescent-lit conference room and coffee percolated continuously in metal pots that had served the department since the 1950s. Maps covered the walls, marked with colored pins indicating search areas and witness interviews. The detective found himself studying Sarah's photograph repeatedly, a young woman with serious eyes and carefully arranged hair, wearing the kind of modest dress that suggested a personality as ordered as her father's timepieces. Wilhelm proved to be a challenging interview subject, his Germanic reserve making emotional expression nearly impossible. He answered questions with mechanical precision, but offered no insights into Sarah's inner life or possible motivations for leaving. When pressed about whether his daughter had seemed troubled or restless, he simply replied that Sarah understood her responsibilities and had never given him cause for concern. Morrison sensed depths beneath this measured response, but couldn't find leverage to penetrate the man's careful composure. Robert Chen provided more emotional testimony but fewer useful details. He described Sarah as devoted and dependable, eager for their upcoming marriage and the security it would provide. She had spoken of children, of maintaining the family business, of building a life within the safe boundaries of Cedar Rapids. When Morrison asked about Sarah's dreams or ambitions beyond marriage, Robert looked genuinely puzzled, as if the question had never occurred to him. The possibility that Sarah might have harbored desires her loved ones never suspected hung unspoken in the stale air of the interview room. By Friday, the organized search had expanded to include state police resources and volunteers from surrounding counties. Divers searched the Cedar River and nearby ponds, their equipment disturbing the peaceful surface of water that might have held secrets. Aircraft flew grid patterns over rural areas, looking for anything unusual in the early spring landscape. Morrison coordinated these efforts while pursuing the standard investigative protocols, contacting bus stations, airports and taxi companies, checking hospital admission records, and sending Sarah's photograph to police departments across the Midwest. The detective found himself returning repeatedly to the clock shop, standing among the timepieces, and trying to understand how someone could disappear so completely from such a confined space. The mechanical rhythms that had provided comfort to Sarah throughout her life now seemed almost mocking, marking time that continued its forward progression while she remained suspended somewhere beyond reach. Morrison stubbed out his cigarette in the growing collection of butts that filled the ashtray on Wilhelm's repair bench, each one representing another hour of investigation that yielded nothing but deeper mystery. As the first week drew to a close, Morrison faced the grim reality that missing person cases grew exponentially more difficult to solve with each passing day. Sarah Kellerman had vanished as thoroughly as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the fading scent of lavender perfume and the relentless ticking of clocks that would continue measuring time long after everyone who remembered her had stopped searching. The fluorescent lights in the Cedar Rapids Police Department's interview room hummed with the persistent electrical buzz that had become the soundtrack to Detective Morrison's investigation. 3 days of questioning had yielded a portrait of Sarah Kellerman so contradictory that Morrison wondered if they were discussing the same person. He poured coffee from the metal percolator into a chipped ceramic mug, noting how the bitter liquid had become his primary sustenance as sleep eluded him and the case consumed his waking hours. Robert Chen sat across the scarred wooden table, his banker's precision beginning to fray around the edges. Under Morrison's patient questioning, cracks appeared in his carefully constructed image of Sarah as the perfect fiancée. Yes, she had seemed distracted lately. No, she hadn't explained why. When pressed for specifics, Robert admitted that Sarah had begun asking unusual questions about their future together, whether they would travel, whether she could continue working after marriage, whether he expected her to have children immediately. These conversations had puzzled him, as he had assumed their path forward was clearly understood by both parties. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Robert's nervous fidgeting with his wedding ring, a gesture that spoke to deeper anxieties than simple concern for a missing fiancée. The young banker's version of Sarah emphasized compliance and predictability, qualities that had attracted him to a woman who would fit seamlessly into his vision of suburban respectability. But Morrison sensed something rehearsed in Robert's responses, as if he were reciting a script rather than sharing genuine memories of the woman he claimed to love. Wilhelm Kellerman proved even more challenging to penetrate. The clockmaker's German heritage had instilled values of privacy and emotional restraint that made psychological excavation nearly impossible. He described his daughter in mechanical terms, reliable, precise, efficient, that revealed more about his expectations than her actual personality. When Morrison asked about Sarah's childhood, Wilhelm spoke of teaching her clock repair, of her aptitude for detail work, of her understanding that the family business required dedication and sacrifice. Morrison noted what Wilhelm didn't mention: friends, interests, dreams that extended beyond the confines of the shop. The detective's attention increasingly focused on a mysterious customer whom multiple witnesses had mentioned, but none could clearly describe. This man appeared regularly at the clock shop, always paying for small purchases with antique silver coins that fascinated Sarah. Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring dress shop remembered seeing him through the window, engaged in animated conversation with Sarah while Wilhelm worked in the back room. The customer's identity remained elusive. No one recalled his name, his address, or even consistent details about his appearance. He existed only as a shadow that might have influenced Sarah in ways her father and fiancé never suspected. Morrison's interviews with Sarah's church acquaintances revealed yet another version of the missing woman. Several members of the social committee described her as increasingly withdrawn in recent months, distracted during meetings and reluctant to commit to future events. Mrs. Hartwell, who had known Sarah since childhood, mentioned observing her reading unusual books, something about women's rights and social change, that seemed inconsistent with her typically conventional interests. These glimpses of intellectual curiosity painted a picture of a young woman beginning to question the narrow parameters of her prescribed life. The detective found himself returning repeatedly to Sarah's bedroom above the clock shop, searching for clues that might illuminate her inner world. The space reflected the same careful order that characterized the shop below: clothes hung in precise arrangements, books aligned with geometric precision, personal items arranged with museum-like attention to detail. Yet Morrison sensed something performative about this perfection, as if Sarah had constructed a stage set rather than inhabited a living space. The very absence of disorder felt suspicious, suggesting someone who worked constantly to maintain an acceptable facade. During his fourth interview with Wilhelm, Morrison detected the first crack in the clockmaker's composed exterior. When asked whether Sarah might have had reasons to leave voluntarily, Wilhelm's hand trembled slightly as he wound a pocket watch, his mechanical precision faltering for just a moment. He spoke of the burden of carrying on family traditions, of the sacrifices required to maintain a business in an increasingly modern world. Morrison heard something beyond duty in Wilhelm's words, a recognition that Sarah might have felt trapped by expectations that had become unbearable. Robert's second interview revealed additional troubling details. Under persistent questioning, he admitted that Sarah had recently asked about his bank's policies regarding women employees, whether married women could maintain independent accounts, and what procedures existed for women seeking business loans. These inquiries had struck him as inappropriate curiosity about matters that wouldn't concern her once they were married. Morrison recognized these questions as evidence of Sarah exploring possibilities for independence that her traditional environment couldn't accommodate. The mysterious customer with the silver coins emerged as Morrison's primary lead when Mrs. Patterson provided additional details. She recalled seeing him arrive at the shop not in a car, but on foot, always approaching from the direction of the bus station. His purchases were always small: watch chains, clock keys, minor repair items, but his conversations with Sarah often lasted far longer than necessary for such simple transactions. Mrs. Patterson had assumed he was simply a lonely old man who enjoyed Sarah's polite attention, but Morrison began to suspect these interactions might have introduced Sarah to ideas and possibilities she had never previously considered. As the first week of investigation concluded, Morrison faced the uncomfortable possibility that everyone who claimed to love Sarah had known only carefully crafted portions of her true self. The perfect daughter, devoted fiancée, and reliable employee might have been masks concealing a young woman desperate for a life beyond the synchronized rhythms of her father's clocks. The question that haunted Morrison as he chain-smoked through another sleepless night was whether Sarah had found the courage to claim that life, or whether someone had prevented her from ever having the chance to try. Detective Morrison's cigarette smoke mingled with the musty scent of old paper as he sat in Wilhelm Kellerman's attic office, surrounded by decades of business records and repair logs. The clockmaker had reluctantly granted permission for a thorough search of the shop and living quarters, though his Germanic reserve made clear his disapproval of strangers rifling through his meticulously organized life. Morrison worked methodically through filing cabinets and storage boxes, looking for anything that might illuminate Sarah's state of mind before her disappearance. The discovery came wedged behind a loose floorboard beneath Sarah's desk, a composition notebook bound with a rubber band, its cover worn smooth from repeated handling. Morrison opened it carefully, his detective's instincts telling him this hidden journal might finally provide the breakthrough his investigation desperately needed. The pages contained months of entries written in Sarah's careful script, documenting a secret correspondence that would shatter her family's understanding of who she really was. The entries began 6 months earlier, triggered by Sarah's encounter with the mysterious customer who had puzzled Morrison throughout his investigation. The man identified himself as Professor Martin Ashford, a sociology professor from the University of Iowa who collected vintage timepieces and had been drawn to the Kellerman shop by its reputation for quality repairs. Their conversations had evolved from discussions of clockwork mechanisms to broader topics about time itself, tradition, and the constraints that society placed upon individual choice. Sarah's writing revealed an intelligent young woman awakening to possibilities she had never imagined. Professor Ashford had introduced her to books about women's liberation, social change, and alternative lifestyles that challenged everything she had accepted as inevitable. Her journal entries documented her growing awareness that marriage to Robert represented not love but surrender, that working in her father's shop was not destiny but limitation, and that the safe boundaries of Cedar Rapids might be a prison rather than protection. Morrison read with growing fascination as Sarah described her secret correspondence with a women's liberation group in Minneapolis. She had written to them initially seeking information about consciousness-raising groups, but her letters had evolved into detailed discussions about escape from traditional expectations. The Minneapolis women had invited her to visit their commune, where she could explore alternatives to conventional marriage and family obligations. Their letters, carefully hidden in the same space as her journal, painted vivid pictures of women creating independent lives through shared resources and mutual support. The journal revealed Sarah's careful planning for a new life that would begin with her disappearance from Cedar Rapids. She had been secretly saving money, skimming small amounts from the shop's daily receipts and hiding cash in a tin box beneath her bedroom floorboards. Morrison found the box exactly where her journal indicated, containing nearly $300, enough for bus fare to Minneapolis and several weeks of basic living expenses. The methodical accumulation of funds demonstrated the same precision she applied to clock repair, but directed toward liberation rather than obligation. Wilhelm's discovery of the journal hit him like a physical blow. Morrison watched the clockmaker's composure crumble as he read his daughter's words describing her life as a suffocating performance, her engagement as a trap, and her future in Cedar Rapids as a kind of death. Sarah wrote about feeling like one of the mechanical figures in his music boxes, programmed to dance the same routine endlessly while real life happened beyond her reach. Her desire for freedom was not rebellion against love, but a desperate hunger for authentic existence. The most devastating entry described Sarah's guilt over her secret planning. She acknowledged her father's devotion and Robert's genuine affection, but explained that accepting their vision for her future would require killing essential parts of herself that had only recently awakened. She wrote about watching her mother's sister Margaret, who had moved to Chicago in the 1940s to pursue a nursing career, and wondering what her own life might have been if she had possessed the courage to claim independence earlier. Robert's reaction to the journal entries revealed the extent of his misunderstanding of the woman he planned to marry. He had interpreted Sarah's recent questions about women's employment and financial independence as intellectual curiosity rather than escape planning. Her inquiries about their future together had been reconnaissance missions, gathering information about the life she was rejecting rather than embracing. His shock at discovering her true feelings transformed quickly into anger that she had deceived him so completely. Morrison recognized that the journal created new possibilities for understanding Sarah's disappearance. If she had indeed executed her escape plan, she might be safely hidden in Minneapolis among women who would protect her anonymity. But the detective's experience warned him that voluntary disappearance required more careful preparation than Sarah's journal suggested. The abandoned purse, the unlocked shop, the engagement ring left behind, these details suggested either panic or prevention rather than planned departure. Wilhelm's reading of his daughter's private thoughts forced him to confront the possibility that his love had become a form of imprisonment. Sarah's journal described feeling like a rare clockwork mechanism, beautiful and valuable, but confined to performing the same limited functions endlessly. Her gratitude for his training and guidance was genuine, but so was her recognition that these gifts had become chains binding her to a life that felt increasingly false. The journal's final entry, written just 2 days before Sarah's disappearance, captured her mounting terror about the approaching point of no return. She described her engagement to Robert as a countdown to personal extinction, her father's expectations as weight that grew heavier each day, and her secret correspondence with Minneapolis as the only light in an increasingly dark future. She wrote about her plan to disappear on March 15th, during the evening hours when the shop would be quiet, and her absence might not be immediately noticed. As Morrison closed the journal and looked at Wilhelm's devastated face, he realized that Sarah's secret life had solved one mystery while creating another. The journal proved she had been planning to leave, but her actual disappearance lacked the careful preparation her writings suggested. Something had gone wrong with her escape plan, leaving behind only the tantalizing possibility that Sarah Kellerman had been reaching for freedom at the moment when freedom was torn away from her forever. The Greyhound bus station in Minneapolis reeked of diesel exhaust and industrial disinfectant when Detective Morrison arrived on a grey April morning, chasing the first substantial lead in Sarah Kellerman's case. A ticket agent named Dorothy Hutchins claimed to have sold a one-way fare to Chicago on March 16th to a young woman matching Sarah's description, nervous, well-dressed, paying with small bills counted out carefully from a cloth purse. Morrison studied the agent's earnest face across the scarred counter, noting how her eagerness to help had perhaps shaped her memory into something more definitive than truth warranted. The bus station's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows as Morrison reviewed the passenger manifest with Dorothy, whose thick glasses magnified eyes bright with the excitement of participating in a real investigation. She pointed to the name, Susan Kelly, written in careful script, insisting this had to be Sarah traveling under an assumed identity. The timing aligned perfectly with Sarah's journal entries about escaping to Minneapolis, but Morrison's experience warned him that coincidences were often mirages that led investigators away from truth rather than toward it. Dorothy's description wavered under careful questioning. The height seemed right, the hair color matched, but details about clothing and demeanor shifted as she struggled to separate what she actually remembered from what she thought she should have noticed. Morrison took detailed notes while recognizing the familiar pattern of well-intentioned witnesses unconsciously editing their memories to fit the story they wanted to tell. The woman boarding the Chicago bus might have been Sarah Kellerman, or she might have been any of a dozen young women seeking fresh starts in unfamiliar cities. The Chicago lead consumed 3 days of Morrison's investigation time and the department's limited travel budget. He worked with local detectives to canvass the areas around the bus terminal, showing Sarah's photograph in boarding houses, diners, and employment agencies that catered to women seeking domestic work. Several people claimed recognition: a waitress at a coffee shop near Union Station, a landlady who rented furnished rooms by the week, a factory foreman who remembered interviewing a quiet young woman for assembly line work. Each lead evaporated under scrutiny, leaving Morrison with the metallic taste of payphone receivers and the growing conviction that he was chasing shadows. The Denver sighting came through official channels 2 weeks later, when Colorado State Police contacted Cedar Rapids about a woman found unconscious near the train yards, carrying identification for Susan Kellerman, close enough to Sarah's name to trigger attention. Morrison arranged for Sarah's photograph to be sent by wire, his hopes rising as he imagined the relief of solving the case with a simple case of amnesia or injury. The photograph came back with a terse notation that the woman was clearly not the same person, despite superficial similarities in age and coloring that had sparked the initial report. Each false lead followed a similar pattern of rising hope and crushing disappointment. A commune in California reported a new member who had arrived without possessions or clear history, fitting the profile of someone fleeing a former life. The woman's reticence about her past and her obvious unfamiliarity with counterculture lifestyle made her stand out among the community's experienced dropouts. Morrison spent precious department resources on long-distance calls and telegrams, only to learn that Sarah was actually Rebecca Martinez, a runaway from Los Angeles whose middle-class background and conservative clothing had created the illusion of connection to his case. Wilhelm Kellerman's emotional investment in each potential sighting made Morrison's job increasingly difficult. The clockmaker would appear at the station every morning, his Germanic composure barely containing desperate hope that today would bring news of Sarah's recovery. Morrison found himself managing Wilhelm's expectations while pursuing leads he privately suspected were worthless, walking the delicate line between maintaining investigative thoroughness and acknowledging the growing probability that Sarah would never be found alive. Robert Chen's reaction to the false leads revealed the complexity of his feelings about Sarah's disappearance. Part of him clearly wanted her found and returned to the life they had planned together, but Morrison detected relief mixed with his anxiety, as if Robert was beginning to understand that the woman described in Sarah's journal bore little resemblance to the compliant fiancée he thought he had known. The discovery of Sarah's secret planning had forced Robert to confront the possibility that their entire relationship had been built on fundamental misunderstanding. The psychological toll on Sarah's family grew with each disappointing lead. Margaret Kellerman, Sarah's mother, developed a nervous habit of starting toward the telephone whenever it rang, her face cycling through hope and dread in the seconds before learning whether the call brought news about her daughter. Morrison watched the family's emotional reserves drain with each false alarm, recognizing that the investigation itself was becoming a source of trauma rather than potential healing. The most painful false lead came in late May, when a social worker in Seattle contacted Cedar Rapids about a young woman found wandering near the waterfront with apparent memory loss. Her age, physical description, and Midwestern accent created enough similarity to Sarah's case that Morrison felt justified in requesting that Wilhelm travel to Washington for identification. The clockmaker's cross-country journey, his first time leaving Iowa, represented enormous emotional and financial investment in what proved to be another devastating disappointment. Morrison began to recognize the pattern that would define the next phase of his investigation. Communities across America contained dozens of young women who had left their families seeking different lives, creating a vast population of potential Sarahs for well-meaning citizens to discover and report. Each sighting reflected genuine desire to help solve a mystery that had captured public attention, but the cumulative effect was to scatter investigative resources across impossible distances while the real answers remained hidden in Cedar Rapids. By summer's end, Morrison had logged over 100 false leads, each one documented meticulously in files that grew thick enough to fill multiple cabinets. The bus stations, train platforms, and payphones had become familiar territory as he chased reports that led nowhere but cost everything. The taste of hope turning to disappointment became so familiar that Morrison learned to recognize the moment in each investigation when possibility died, leaving behind only the administrative duty to close another false lead and wait for the next impossible report that Sarah Kellerman had been found alive in a world that seemed determined to provide everything except the truth. The first snowfall of November 1973 dusted downtown Cedar Rapids with a thin layer of white that reminded Detective Morrison of the ash that coated evidence files when cases grew cold. He stood outside the Kellerman clock shop, watching through frost-edged windows as Wilhelm mechanically performed the same repair work that had defined his days before Sarah's disappearance. 8 months of investigation had produced hundreds of pages of reports, dozens of interviews, and thousands of hours of detective work that led nowhere except to the bitter acknowledgement that some mysteries would never yield their secrets. Morrison's supervisor, Captain Bradley, had been diplomatically suggesting for weeks that the department's resources might be better allocated to cases with higher probability of resolution. The The detective understood the practical mathematics, overtime pay, travel expenses, and administrative costs for a missing person case that had generated national attention but precious little evidence. Other crimes demanded immediate attention, while Sarah Kellerman existed only as a photograph pinned to the bulletin board and a file cabinet full of documents that recorded exhaustive investigation into a perfect void. The final official search took place on a grey afternoon when volunteers from Sarah's church and community groups combed through Palisades Kepler State Park one last time. Morrison coordinated the effort with diminished enthusiasm, going through motions that had become ritual rather than genuine investigation. The searchers moved through bare November woods calling Sarah's name, their voices echoing off limestone bluffs that had witnessed centuries of human passage while keeping their secrets intact. Wilhelm's transformation during the investigation had been painful to witness. The precise clockmaker, who once moved through his shop with mechanical efficiency, now seemed lost among his own timepieces, starting tasks and abandoning them, forgetting appointments with customers who grew accustomed to finding the shop closed during regular business hours. Morrison would sometimes discover Wilhelm simply standing motionless in the center of his workspace, surrounded by the synchronized ticking that once provided comfort but now seemed to mock the passage of time that brought no answers about his daughter's fate. Robert Chen had gradually withdrawn from the investigation as the months passed, and it became clear that the Sarah described in her journal bore little resemblance to the woman he had planned to marry. His relief at escaping marriage to someone who would have been perpetually unhappy was tempered by genuine concern for her safety and lingering guilt about his failure to recognize her desperation. By autumn, Robert had begun dating a young teacher whose conventional aspirations aligned more closely with his own vision of suburban respectability. The Women's Liberation Group in Minneapolis had cooperated fully with Morrison's investigation, providing copies of their correspondence with Sarah and submitting to interviews that revealed the depth of her desire to escape traditional expectations. Their leader, Dr. Catherine Wells, spoke movingly about Sarah's letters describing her feelings of suffocation and her terror of becoming trapped in a life that would require abandoning essential parts of herself. The group had prepared space for Sarah in their commune, but she had never arrived or made contact after March 15th. Morrison's own relationship with the case had evolved from professional duty to personal obsession that interfered with sleep and other investigations. He found himself returning repeatedly to the clock shop, studying the space where Sarah had vanished and searching for details that might have escaped previous scrutiny. The mechanical rhythms that surrounded him during these visits became a kind of meditation, each tick marking another second in which Sarah remained missing, while time continued its relentless forward motion. The last promising lead had come in September, when construction workers renovating the basement of a downtown building discovered a woman's shoe that matched the description of footwear Sarah had been wearing. Morrison spent hours examining the leather Oxford with forensics experts, noting wear patterns and construction details that seemed consistent with Sarah's careful attention to quality and appearance. DNA testing was still years away from practical application, leaving only visual identification and circumstantial evidence that could never definitively connect the shoe to Sarah Kellerman. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, the University of Iowa psychologist Morrison had consulted about the case, provided the framework that eventually allowed him to accept unsatisfying conclusions. She explained that young women in Sarah's situation often experienced psychological breaking points that could lead to impulsive decisions or dangerous encounters. The gap between Sarah's careful escape planning and the chaotic circumstances of her disappearance suggested either panic that derailed her plan or interference from someone who prevented its execution. The final case conference took place in the same fluorescent-lit room where Morrison had interviewed dozens of witnesses and suspects who knew nothing useful about Sarah's disappearance. Captain Bradley reviewed the investigation's scope, over 200 interviews, searches covering 3 states, cooperation with federal authorities, and consultation with experts in missing persons cases. The mathematical conclusion was inescapable. They had exhausted every reasonable lead and several unreasonable ones without discovering evidence that could advance the investigation. Morrison cleaned out his desk on December 15, 1973, exactly 9 months after Sarah Kellerman had disappeared from the world as completely as if she had never existed. The files would remain open, technically, but active investigation would cease unless new evidence emerged. He packed Sarah's photograph last, studying the serious young woman who had hidden dreams of liberation beneath a facade of perfect compliance. The image captured everything Morrison had learned about the case: beauty, mystery, and the terrible possibility that some questions have no answers. The detective's final visit to the Kellerman clock shop found Wilhelm alone among his timepieces, winding springs and adjusting mechanisms with the same careful precision that had defined his life before Sarah's disappearance changed everything. Morrison left his business card on the repair counter, knowing that Wilhelm would never call but needing to maintain the illusion that investigation might someday resume. As he walked away from the shop, Morrison could hear the synchronized ticking of hundreds of clocks marking time that would continue long after everyone who remembered Sarah Kellerman had stopped wondering what happened to her on March 15, 1973. The spring morning of 1993 brought unseasonably warm weather to Cedar Rapids as Detective Frank Morrison, now Lieutenant Morrison, pulled into the parking lot of the Kellerman clock shop for what would be his final visit before retirement. 20 years had weathered the gold lettering on the storefront window and added deep lines to his face, but the synchronized ticking that greeted him as he pushed through the door remained exactly as he remembered from that March evening when Sarah Kellerman first vanished from the world. Wilhelm Kellerman had aged dramatically in the 2 decades since his daughter's disappearance, his once precise movements now deliberate and careful as he navigated between display cases with the aid of a wooden cane. The shop itself had become a museum of mechanical timekeeping, with fewer customers seeking repairs in an era when digital watches and battery-operated clocks made the ancient craft of spring-driven mechanisms seem quaint rather than essential. Wilhelm's hands still possessed their remarkable steadiness when working with delicate clockwork, but Morrison noticed how the old man's eyes had developed the distant quality of someone who lived more in memory than present moment. The conversation began with the careful politeness of 2 men who shared a profound failure: Morrison's inability to solve the case that had defined the middle years of his career, and Wilhelm's failure to understand his daughter well enough to prevent her desperate desire for escape. They discussed the weather, the changing character of downtown Cedar Rapids, and the gradual obsolescence of mechanical timepieces in ways that avoided direct mention of Sarah, while acknowledging her invisible presence in every word exchanged between them. Morrison had brought copies of Sarah's file, now containing over 300 pages of reports, interviews, and correspondence that documented the most thorough investigation in Cedar Rapids Police Department history. He offered them to Wilhelm as a gesture that seemed appropriate, returning the documentary remains of Sarah's life to the man who had created her and lost her. Wilhelm accepted the files with trembling hands, though both men understood he would probably never find the emotional strength to read testimony that would force him to confront how little he had known about his daughter's inner life. The decades had brought occasional flickers of hope in the form of new leads and potential breakthroughs that invariably led nowhere. A skeleton discovered during highway construction in 1978 proved to belong to a Native American woman who had died centuries before Sarah's birth. A confession from a dying man in 1985 contained details that didn't match the case facts, revealing itself as the fantasy of someone seeking final attention before death. Each false alarm had reopened wounds that never fully healed, reminding Wilhelm that hope could be more painful than acceptance. Robert Chen had built a successful banking career and raised 3 children with the conventional wife who had replaced Sarah in his affections. Morrison occasionally encountered him at community events, where Robert maintained polite interest in any developments regarding Sarah, while making clear that his emotional investment in the case had ended long ago. The comfortable suburban life that Sarah had rejected had provided Robert with exactly the satisfaction she had feared it would deny her, creating a parallel universe where their marriage might have worked if she had been different or he had been more understanding. The women's liberation movement that had inspired Sarah's escape planning had evolved into mainstream feminism that made her desires for independence and self-determination seem less radical than tragically ordinary. Morrison reflected on how Sarah's hunger for alternatives to traditional marriage and family expectations would have found countless outlets in the changed social landscape of the 1980s and 1990s. She had been born a generation too early for her dreams, trapped between old expectations and new possibilities that remained just beyond her reach. Professor Martin Ashford, the sociology professor whose ideas had sparked Sarah's awakening, had died in 1987 without ever learning what happened to the young woman whose questions about freedom and choice had impressed him during their conversations in the clock shop. Morrison had interviewed Ashford multiple times over the years, finding him genuinely disturbed by the possibility that his influence had contributed to Sarah's disappearance. The professor's own research into women's changing roles in American society had been shaped partly by his brief relationship with a young woman whose fate remained unknown. The Minneapolis commune where Sarah had planned to begin her new life had disbanded in 1979, its members scattered across the country, as the idealism of the early 1970s gave way to more practical concerns about careers and financial security. Dr. Catherine Wells, who had corresponded with Sarah about alternatives to conventional life, had become a successful therapist specializing in women's issues. She occasionally contacted Morrison about similar cases, but none had ever matched the complete disappearance that characterized Sarah's vanishing. As Morrison prepared to leave the clock shop for the final time, Wilhelm surprised him by producing a small wooden box from beneath the repair counter. Inside, carefully preserved in tissue paper, was Sarah's engagement ring, the symbol of the future she had rejected and the life she would never live. Wilhelm explained that Robert had returned it shortly after the investigation ended, unable to keep a reminder of promises that would never be fulfilled. The ring had waited in the box for 20 years, a physical anchor to a young woman who had otherwise disappeared completely from the material world. The two men stood surrounded by the mechanical chorus that had provided the soundtrack to Sarah's life and continued marking time in her absence. Morrison realized that solving the case had become less important than understanding what it revealed about the price of conformity and the courage required to claim authentic existence. Sarah Kellerman had vanished at the moment she reached for freedom, becoming a ghost that haunted not just her family and friends, but also the social expectations that had made escape seem preferable to survival. Morrison's final entry in the Sarah Kellerman file was a single sentence: "Investigation suspended pending new evidence that may never come." He left the clock shop knowing that retirement would not free him from wondering what happened to a young woman whose desire for independence had led either to liberation or destruction. The synchronized ticking that followed him to the door would continue long after everyone who remembered Sarah was gone, marking time in a world where some mysteries remain forever unsolved, and some disappearances achieve a kind of immortality through their very incompleteness. The demolition of the Old Mercy Hospital began on a humid Tuesday morning in August 2003, 30 years after Sarah Kellerman's disappearance had captivated Cedar Rapids and frustrated every attempt at resolution. The building had stood empty for 5 years, since the medical center relocated to a modern facility on the city's expanding periphery, leaving behind a hulking brick structure that represented both outdated healthcare delivery and prime downtown real estate ripe for redevelopment. Construction foreman Miguel Santos had supervised dozens of demolition projects during his 20-year career, but something about the hospital's basement level troubled him as his crew worked through the subterranean maze of storage rooms, mechanical spaces, and abandoned morgue facilities. The building's original construction in 1923 had created numerous dead spaces behind false walls and beneath staircases where decades of hospital detritus had accumulated: old medical equipment, forgotten files, and institutional furniture that had been easier to abandon than remove. The discovery came during the systematic clearing of a storage room that had been sealed behind a newer wall sometime in the 1970s. Santos's sledgehammer broke through the drywall barrier, releasing the musty scent of long enclosed space mixed with something else that made the veteran foreman step back and call for his crew to stop work immediately. His flashlight beam revealed a small chamber containing medical supplies that had been abandoned decades earlier, but it was the bundle of clothing in the corner that made Santos reach for his cell phone to contact the police. Detective Sharon Walsh, who had joined the Cedar Rapids Police Department long after Sarah Kellerman's case had grown cold, arrived at the demolition site with no immediate understanding of what the construction crew might have discovered. The clothing appeared to be women's garments from an earlier era: a blue wool skirt, white blouse, and brown leather shoes that had been carefully arranged, as if someone had folded laundry rather than concealing evidence. Walsh photographed everything in place before carefully bagging each item for forensic examination. The first breakthrough came when Walsh checked the clothing against missing persons files that stretched back decades, searching for cases that might involve similar garments or circumstances. Sarah Kellerman's file photograph showed her wearing a blue wool skirt and white blouse on the day of her disappearance, creating enough similarity to justify contacting Frank Morrison, now 3 years into retirement but still haunted by the case that had defined his career. Morrison arrived at the police station within an hour of Walsh's phone call, his hands trembling slightly as he examined the preserved clothing that might finally provide answers he had sought for 30 years. The leather shoes proved most significant for identification purposes. Morrison remembered Wilhelm Kellerman's detailed description of Sarah's footwear, handcrafted Oxfords purchased from a specialty shop in Iowa City, with distinctive wear patterns that reflected her careful gait and slightly uneven leg length from a childhood injury. The preserved shoes matched Wilhelm's description perfectly, down to the small metal plates on the heels that Sarah had requested to prevent excessive wear on expensive leather. Wilhelm Kellerman's reaction to news of the discovery revealed the complex emotions that 3 decades of uncertainty had created. At 87, the clockmaker had long since accepted that he would die without learning Sarah's fate, finding a kind of peace in the mystery that had tormented his middle years. The possibility of finally understanding what happened to his daughter brought not relief, but a renewal of grief that he had thought was safely buried beneath the accumulated weight of passing time. The forensic examination of the storage room revealed additional evidence that had been preserved by the sealed environment. Scraps of paper found beneath the clothing included fragments of a Minneapolis address that matched Sarah's correspondence with the Women's Liberation Group, confirming the connection between the discovered garments and the missing young woman. More disturbing was the presence of medical supplies in the sealed room, surgical instruments, anesthesia equipment, and pharmaceutical bottles that suggested the space had been used for purposes beyond simple storage. Detective Walsh's investigation into the hospital's history during the 1970s uncovered a troubling pattern of staff irregularities and administrative cover-ups that the medical establishment had worked to suppress. Dr. Richard Hoffman, who had served as chief of surgery during Sarah's disappearance, had been quietly dismissed in 1974 following allegations of professional misconduct that were never fully investigated or prosecuted. Hospital records showed that Hoffman had access to basement storage areas and had frequently worked alone during evening hours when minimal staff would have been present to monitor his activities. The breakthrough in understanding came when Walsh located Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired anesthesiologist who had worked at Mercy Hospital during the relevant period and remembered troubling interactions with Dr. Hoffman. Chen recalled the surgeon's inappropriate interest in young women who visited the hospital, his tendency to volunteer for emergency procedures involving attractive female patients, and his habit of remaining in the building during off hours when legitimate medical activities would not have required his presence. Morrison's return to active investigation, working as a consultant to Detective Walsh, brought renewed focus to connections between Dr. Hoffman and Sarah Kellerman that had never been explored during the original case. Hospital employment records showed that Hoffman had consulted at the clinic, where Sarah received medical treatment for minor ailments, creating opportunities for the predatory surgeon to identify vulnerable young women who might become targets for his criminal activities. The most damning evidence emerged from Dr. Chen's reluctant testimony about a conversation she had overheard in March 1973, when Dr. Hoffman spoke with a colleague about a procedure he had performed to help a young woman solve her problem without involving traditional medical channels. Chen had assumed the conversation referenced illegal abortion services, which some physicians provided despite legal restrictions, but she now recognized the possibility that Hoffman's activities had been far more sinister than reproductive health care delivered outside official protocols. The investigation's tragic conclusion came when Walsh and Morrison confronted the overwhelming evidence that Sarah Kellerman had fallen victim to Dr. Richard Hoffman's predatory behavior during what should have been routine medical treatment. The sealed storage room had served as Hoffman's private operating theater for activities that had nothing to do with legitimate medicine and everything to do with the exploitation of vulnerable young women who trusted medical authority and had no reason to suspect danger. Wilhelm Kellerman's final visit to the police station to review the evidence that explained his daughter's fate was witnessed by both Morrison and Walsh, who understood they were observing the end of a mystery that had consumed 3 decades while revealing the beginning of a different kind of pain. The old clockmaker listened to their carefully presented conclusions with the same mechanical precision he had once applied to repairing timepieces, asking detailed questions about evidence and methodology, while his hands remained perfectly steady despite the emotional earthquake that was restructuring everything he thought he knew about Sarah's disappearance. Dr. Richard Hoffman had died in 1987, taking his secrets with him and ensuring that justice for Sarah Kellerman would be limited to understanding rather than legal accountability. The discovery of her clothing and the reconstruction of her final hours provided answers that brought no peace, only the bitter knowledge that evil had been hiding behind medical authority, while a family suffered through 30 years of uncertainty about a young woman whose only crime was seeking health care from someone who had perverted his professional obligations into instruments of harm. The memorial service for Sarah Kellerman took place on a brilliant October morning in 2003, 30 years and 7 months after her disappearance had first torn through the comfortable certainties of Cedar Rapids life. The same church where she had planned to marry Robert Chen now hosted a gathering that celebrated her brief existence while mourning the decades of life that had been stolen from her by a predator who had hidden behind medical authority and professional respectability. Wilhelm Kellerman, now 88 and moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age, had insisted on speaking at the service, despite his family's concerns about the emotional toll. His voice carried the same precise cadence that had once described clockwork mechanisms to curious customers, but now applied itself to memories of a daughter whose complexity he had finally learned to appreciate through 30 years of painful reflection about dreams deferred and freedom denied. Detective Frank Morrison, officially retired but emotionally invested in Sarah's case until death would claim him, sat in the front pew alongside Detective Sharon Walsh, whose methodical investigation had finally provided answers to questions that had haunted him through the best years of his career. Morrison's weathered hands held the case file that had grown from a few pages of initial reports to multiple volumes documenting the most exhaustive missing person investigation in Cedar Rapids history. Robert Chen attended with his wife and 3 children, representing the conventional life that Sarah had rejected, and that might have provided happiness if she had been a different person, or if he had possessed greater understanding of her need for independence and authentic self-expression. His presence acknowledged both the genuine affection they had shared and his recognition that their planned marriage would have been a catastrophe for both participants. The women's liberation activists from Minneapolis who had corresponded with Sarah about alternatives to traditional expectations traveled to Cedar Rapids to honor a young woman whose desire for freedom had been cut short at the moment she reached for it. Dr. Catherine Wells, now in her 70s and still advocating for women's rights, spoke movingly about Sarah's letters describing her hunger for authentic existence and her terror of becoming trapped in a life that would require abandoning essential parts of herself. Professor Martin Ashford's widow attended the service as a representative of her late husband, who had died without knowing that his conversations with Sarah about social change and individual choice had contributed to her awakening consciousness about alternatives to conventional expectations. Mrs. Ashford carried a letter that the sociology professor had written but never sent, expressing his hope that the young woman from the clock shop would find the courage to claim the independent life she obviously craved. The service attracted media attention that transformed Sarah's story into a symbol of the dangers faced by women who challenged traditional expectations during an era when social change was accelerating, but institutional protections remained inadequate. Reporters interviewed family members, investigators, and community leaders about lessons learned from a case that revealed how predators could exploit positions of authority while their victims' families suffered through decades of uncertainty and self-blame. Wilhelm Kellerman's final act regarding his daughter's memory was the establishment of a scholarship fund for young women seeking education or training that would provide economic independence and professional fulfillment. The Sarah Kellerman Memorial Fund would eventually help hundreds of women pursue careers in fields that had been largely closed to Sarah's generation, creating a legacy that honored her aspirations while acknowledging the opportunities she had been denied. The clock shop continued operating for 2 more years after Sarah's memorial service, with Wilhelm maintaining his meticulous repair work while training a young apprentice who showed genuine interest in the ancient craft of mechanical timepiece restoration. The synchronized ticking that had provided the soundtrack to Sarah's life continued marking time in her absence, creating a meditation on the persistence of mechanical rhythm in a world where human existence proved far more fragile than spring-driven clockwork. Morrison's final contribution to Sarah's case was a comprehensive report that analyzed investigative procedures and identified systematic failures that had allowed Dr. Richard Hoffman's criminal activities to continue undetected for years. His recommendations led to improved protocols for investigating missing persons cases and enhanced scrutiny of medical professionals who worked alone with vulnerable patients during non-standard hours. Detective Walsh's career was shaped profoundly by her work on Sarah's case, inspiring her specialization in cold case investigations and her advocacy for improved forensic techniques that might solve mysteries that had frustrated previous generations of investigators. She often spoke at police conferences about the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining case files, since technological advances and changing social awareness could provide new approaches to old puzzles. The demolition of Mercy Hospital was completed in early 2004, with the site redeveloped into a mixed-use complex containing retail stores, professional offices, and residential apartments. A small memorial garden near the building's entrance honored patients who had died in the hospital during its 80-year history, including a discreet plaque mentioning Sarah Kellerman, among other victims of violence whose lives had ended within the building's walls. Wilhelm Kellerman died peacefully in his sleep in January 2006, surrounded by the ticking of hundreds of clocks that had measured his life's work and witnessed his greatest sorrow. His funeral drew mourners from across the Midwest, including clock collectors, repair craftsmen, and community members who remembered his dignity during the terrible years when Sarah's fate remained unknown. The clock shop was sold to his apprentice, ensuring that the mechanical rhythms that had defined the Kellerman family's contribution to Cedar Rapids would continue long after the last person who remembered Sarah had joined her in whatever realm awaits those whose earthly time has ended. Frank Morrison lived until 2011, spending his final years writing a book about Sarah's case that examined how social expectations, institutional failures, and individual evil had combined to destroy a young woman whose only crime was seeking authentic existence in a world that demanded conformity. The book became required reading at police academies across the Midwest, ensuring that Sarah Kellerman's story would continue teaching investigators about the importance of thoroughness, persistence, and respect for victims whose lives were more complex than their disappearances initially suggested. The last clock in Wilhelm Kellerman's shop was wound on a winter evening in 2015, when the building's new owners decided to modernize the space for contemporary retail use. The mechanical timepieces were donated to museums and collectors, who promised to maintain the delicate mechanisms that had once measured Sarah Kellerman's days, while she planned for a freedom that would be denied her by forces more malevolent than the social expectations she had hoped to escape. Time continued its relentless forward motion, carrying Cedar Rapids deeper into the 21st century, while Sarah Kellerman remained forever frozen at age 23, preserved in memory as a young woman who had possessed the courage to dream of independence, but had been prevented from discovering whether those dreams could sustain a lifetime of authentic existence. Her story became a reminder that every generation must protect those who seek alternatives to conventional expectations, since the forces that destroyed Sarah Kellerman continue threatening anyone who dares to claim authentic life in a world that too often demands conformity at the cost of individual truth.